Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be looking at really a vast array of issues, and we're very honored to have Dr. John Cobb on the program today. And Dr. Cobb is internationally renowned for a large part of the 50 books that he co-edited and wrote on his own over the years. Dr. John Cobb is an American theologian, philosopher, and environmentalist. Dr. Cobb is often regarded as a preeminent scholar in the field of process philosophy and process theology, the school of thought associated with the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. Dr. John Cobb, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you.
I appreciate you being with me today. It's an honor to have you, and we have a lot to discuss, and we're going to get into it. But you're often identified with a new concept called ecological civilization, and you describe this as sort of an alternative to the modern industrial society. What is this term, ecological civilization, and what is our modern industrial society? Is there a definition of that right now?
Well, I'll begin by ecological civilization.
Okay.
And I learned recently that the term originated in the United Nations literature, so I feel comfortable using it on United Nations property. But it has become important because it has been adopted by China as its goal. So China is aiming to become an ecological civilization. Now let me hasten to say, one reason that they have lifted up this goal is because they are having so many very serious ecological problems. This is not a matter of claiming that they have become, but it makes a big difference. And I'll indicate one difference that it has made as a way of getting into the question of what it is. China was on the way to copy the United States in developing an industrial agriculture. Obviously an extension of the industrial world we were talking about. But after having adopted the goal of ecological civilization, the government was persuaded that you can't have an ecological civilization unless you have an ecological agriculture and ecological villages. So China has shifted and is placing a great deal of emphasis and effort to develop its rural population, and it's of course the cities are still of enormous size. I do not mean that, but the flow of people has reversed slightly. A few more people are now going back to the countryside as a result. Since there are maybe 300 million people who are involved, I think this is an important shift. Our ecological civilization has replaced an earlier term, sustainable society, that in the 70s we used to describe what we wanted. But I think ecological civilization is a richer term. Of course it must be sustainable. And of course that means, in relationship to weather, we have to do something very dramatic in the next 10 years, or there's no hope for ever attaining it. So it has many of the same effects. But when we say ecological, it suggests that human society needs to fit into the wider ecology. And an ecology is a pattern within nature where lots of very diverse phenomena support one another rather than conflict and compete with one another. So it has more specific implication for what the society would be like that could be called an ecological civilization.
Now, you mentioned sustainable development, that type of thing. That term came, as I recall, from the Brundtland Commission report, and it was really gained traction in the 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro, and that was a very prominent term. When we talk about that, what are we saying? That people, we need to use the natural resources, but we need to replenish them, we need to replace them, we need to have future resources for future generations, as opposed to just a massive exploitation and destruction of the environment. Is that a large part of it?
That's a large part of sustainability. Unfortunately, President Bush talked about sustainability, and what he wanted to sustain was economic growth. And that really made the word sustainable difficult to use. You have to specify what you want to sustain. Obviously, economic growth as such cannot be sustained. It is the rapid growth that is not sensitive to its consequences that is destroying the earth. So that's one reason for moving to a different language. But clearly an ecological civilization must be sustainable.
Mm-hmm. And the economy is a critical part of that, obviously. Any society has to have an economy.
That's
be
right.
It if they're bartering or trading beads or whatever,
Yes,
whatever it
yeah.
may be, it doesn't matter. But for years we've used this gross domestic product
Yes.
to determine whether or not our society has been successful or whether we're improving, we're accelerating, we're
Yeah.
achieving. The UN, I know I don't speak for the UN,
Yes,
but
yes.
I've read the Human Development Reports, and they have a new way of looking at this, saying that maybe the gross domestic product is not the best way of looking at it because it is, first off, unsustainable. It is for many societies. But do you have or do you use the GDP, or do you have another term?
Well, I think gross domestic product is something that benefits a few people, the increase of gross domestic product. And when a country is very poor, probably the increase of the gross domestic product is an essential factor in bringing people to a decent standard of living. So I don't want to say it's only bad, but in a world like ours, it does vastly more harm than good. In China, they felt that they had to keep measuring the economy, but that they needed to give equal weight to measuring the ecology. I think they have recognized that's not a good thing to do. We need to measure the well-being of the economy by measures that really measure how well off the people are. Mm-hmm. And GDP only measures how much economic activity there is in the market. Mm-hmm. And so it encourages industrialization, it encourages corporate rule, but it encourages also simply the increased exploitation of resources. And this is exactly the opposite of what we need. Mm-hmm. So it's very important that GDP be abolished as a measure of anything worth measuring. And we need to replace it in the number of opportunities, and I think the UN is making great contributions. I worked on developing an index of sustainable economic welfare. It was very conservative in that I didn't introduce anything that members of the economic profession have not indicated properly used, but it showed that in the United States, and this was back in the late 80s, that while GDP, on those days it was GNP, but I don't think that's an important distinction, while that was going up, economic welfare was going down. So to just put all of our energies into making an index go up, that while doing that is making human welfare, economic welfare go down, is not rational. But it does work well for corporations. They depend upon increase in trade, whether that helps people or not.
What are some of the other indicators that we would look at, for example, to see if a society is improving, a society is advancing and progressing? Where we look at things such as happiness index. We would look at things like how much land is put in the common good for future generations, how much we've reduced diseases or infant death mortalities or things like that. Would those all factor in, be indicators?
They would all be indicators of whether we're making progress toward an ecological civilization. We probably still need a specific economic indicator. And we worked on one that we call the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, and it has morphed into the Genuine Progress Index. So anybody can look it up on the web if they want to see. It's Mark Anielski has done a lot of work in Canada, has done a lot of work on indicators. If you get into it, you'll find it's a complex matter. I was recently in China, and they were talking about a GEP, which was genuine ecological progress, or something like that. I know the GEP were the initials, and they are using it in the province of Yunnan in order to measure whether things are really advancing. And Yunnan is a province of China that still has lots of forests and people living in and off of the forest and so forth. And the implications for policy are very, very different when you look at how well off economically the people of the province are, and don't just ask how much is happening on the market.
And that leads us into an offshoot of that. When we have to look at economic systems.
Yes.
And of course we live in sort of a mixed economy, sort of a capitalist market type of economy. These northern Scandinavian countries have a little more of a socialist democratic type of system. It varies around the world, different countries and region to region. But many scholars, or not scholars, let's say economists and folks like that, now are saying that so many of the economic markers that we're using and so many of the economic goals that we're using are really very unsustainable. For example, trying to constantly satisfy shareholders who buy your stock in a company because you know if you do not keep paying them more and more each quarter, they're going to bail out and get stock in some other company or just stop buying, whatever the case might be. How sustainable are these economic systems? Do we need to look at a total overhaul or maybe a retinkering or retooling of these economic systems?
Well, if we just look at the history of corporations, see what they were originally founded for, and then how they have taken over primacy in the economic world, you see something that needs to be reversed in some way. No. Corporations were originally created by states in order to perform particular services for the states. That kind of corporation we can celebrate. But now corporations have more power than governments. And that means that decisions are made for the benefit of corporations who are interested, as you indicate, in being able to pay more money to stockholders. That's their job. I understand that a corporation that made a decision to do something that would reduce the income can be sued by stockholders for having done that. Well, to have an institution that is simply set up to increase the use of resources at a time when we are overusing resources, that is not acceptable. Obviously, corporations are going to resist being dramatically overhauled. I think there's a little more chance in China than there is in the United States. The government is still in control of the economy rather than being in the service of the corporate world. But it's even there, it's difficult.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. If you're involved with any type of a television outlet, be it a PBS, a community access television station, or you're with a university or an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you like our shows and you want to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues. Today we're talking with Dr. John Cobb. Dr. John Cobb is a prolific author. He has written and co-edited over 50 books, and he's so knowledgeable in so many different areas on sustainable development, the economy, ecology, the environment, and just on across the board. And we're going to try to cover all of them today. Dr. Cobb, we're moving in that direction. But let's get back into the economics of this whole situation, because that is so critical. We hear that, again, that with the markers that we have out there, and we look at the economic conditions, we see there is some progress being made with the, I won't go too deep in the weeds on this, but like with the UN Millennium Development Goals that ran from 2000 to 2015, there was progress made on helping to reduce poverty. The UN has promoted now, all the countries of the world, 193 countries came together on the Sustainable Development Goals to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger, to combat climate change between 2016 and 2030. How does this mobilization of the world to focus on the economic issues, but also all of these other issues to empower women so that they have more of a voice, to clean the oceans, which are becoming polluted, overfished? How do they all interface with each other and work together? What is the interdependence there?
Well, one of the reasons for using a word like ecological civilization is to say, is to give a name to what all of that is working towards. An ecological civilization has to be one, well, I would say one that is based on communities and communities of communities and communities of communities of communities, instead of the individual and total society view that has dominated in the past decades. So we are happy when a relatively small local community, that's anywhere we can meet 500 people, we meet 5,000. I mean, it's so, we need to keep these things very flexible, is able to manage its own economy. Instead of thinking that the best organization of the world is to flatten it out and have every people specialize on what they are best at and then trade it with others, which then uses an enormous amount of energy simply in transporting goods around. We think it's much better if every community becomes as self-supporting and possible. Without some control over your own economy, you can't really have any political power. You're simply dependent upon other people. And that's true at the national level. It's also true at more local levels. So this is a kind of, and from my point of view, an ecological civilization is an ideal almost opposite to the ideal of one global economy that has dominated in the past.
Now, back around 1991-92, you co-edited a book called For the Common Good, and you were recognized by to receive the prestigious Grawemeyer Award, which I'll put a plug in for my old alma mater at the University of Louisville, and this is a very prestigious award that's given once a year in 5 different areas: religion, education, world order, that type of thing. What was the thrust of For the Common Good? Does that reflect a lot of the ideas you're talking about today?
That's right. Though at that time I'd never heard the term ecological civilization, I think that what we were hoping for is what can now be called ecological civilization. And actually when we wrote it, the term that was in our mind was economics for community. You see, our whole economic theory is based on a radical individualism. And we think that isolated individuals, isolated meaning the well-being of one has nothing to do with the well-being of another. You have to treat each one separately. There's no way of benefiting a community as a whole. We think all of that needs to be reversed. We think that people are benefited more by the improvement of the community in which they live than by improving their relative standing in relationship to other members of the community, or just simply their individual well-being. We think we are constituted deeply by our relations with one another. Relations to other people make a great deal more difference with respect to how well off I am than how much money I have in the bank.
Mm-hmm. Do we need to look at the situations taking place today? We see a lot of countries that are starting to, instead of being part of international organizations or international agreements, and it varies to a degree, but we see countries like Hungary, the United States, Italy, Brazil, different countries like that, that are developing what some people would call a nationalistic approach.
Yes.
Now, that may not be the proper term, but that's what you read in the papers.
Yeah, we understand.
And is that really taking us back to the pre-World War I conditions? Were those not the major thrust, where you had all sovereign states? The League of Nations was floundering. Well, really, the League of Nations came after World War I. It came in 1919, and World War I was 1914 to 1918. But is that taking us back to setting the stage for a vast array of misunderstandings, a lack of pulling together to work on common problems?
Well, I'm afraid I'm one of those who says a plague on both your houses. Okay. Nationalism is obviously extremely dangerous, and we live in a very dangerous world because there's as much nationalism as there is. But unfortunately, globalism has been systematically destructive of human communities. It doesn't have to be, but the economic globalism, the trade treaties, all of them work against human communities. And we just think that the idea of ecological civilization could replace both this idea of a global economy in which every locality is simply exploited for the benefit of the whole, and some individuals get very rich and most get very poor and so forth. I think that's what's been happening recently, so I don't like that at all. And on the other hand, nationalism. That's why we like to speak of communities, and each nation should be itself a community of communities. But then it needs to relate to other nations, so that one has a community of communities. We thought that the European, when I say we now, Herman Daly and I, we thought the European community was a wonderful move. The European countries were no longer a threat to world peace, but we also thought that the common currency was a bad idea. The common currency centralizes power. We saw recently Greece could not solve its problems. It just had to go to the banks to ask permission, and it didn't get it. If the Greeks had control of their own currency, they would have been much better off. I think that by disempowering countries in that way, making them all serve the economic order, we have created a condition where they rebel against that and want to affirm nationalism, which is just as bad. So let's hope that we can work for a community relationship rather than individual.
And in our last 30 seconds, what do you see as our major challenge as we move forward?
Well, right at the moment, the major challenge is to do something about the climate. And I hope in the process of doing that, we will be making progress toward ecological civilization in general. But if the climate goes really crazy, we won't be able to feed ourselves, and all kinds of things. Horrors will result.
That's exactly correct, and that's what the recent United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report said. We have approximately 10 years to try to slow it down, not reverse it. We're not going to reverse it, but slow it down, or we're going to see famine. We're going to see wars with people fighting over scarce natural resources like water. And we've got to move forward on this. We've got to move away from fossil fuels, get onto clean energy. That's only one approach. There are many other things. But Dr. John Cobb, there's so many other ideas we could talk about, but we're out of time. And I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.